I'm Caden Love.
And I'm Seema Love, his wife.
And we are Love and Lore, taking dark fantasy, light fantasy, and everything in between. And today we wanted to talk about something that has kind of come up while we've been reading a book called One Dark Window. And what are your thoughts so far on this?
Well, when Caden was the one who recommended this book to me, I expected to be less of a romantasy and more of just fantasy. Even though I'm personally liking the idea of the world and where it's going so far, we haven't finished it. We definitely laugh a little bit as we listen to it because the narrator will say something and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so romantasy.
Yeah, and I wanted to read it with her because she likes romantasy and I'd heard it was really good. And I will admit I'm really struggling with it right now. And it's just because of certain tropes that feel like they are so overdone. So we want to talk about some of those today. So the ones that inspired this was especially the dark, brooding man, the captain of the guard, the male interest that the minute you walks in and he's described as dark, brooding, and beautiful, you know exactly his entire arc.
That's actually the first thing that I wanted to mention in this video. As I was listening to this book, I realized something about myself, and it is that I do not like when in books, when someone, like a new character appears, and the first thing they say about them is they were beautiful. Like, it makes sense to describe someone as beautiful if they are beautiful, so I don't want to say that you should never do that, but it's done so much in certain romantasy books that it just starts to feel like a thirst trap. Honestly, at this point, I would rather have a poetic explanation, like, oh, his hair reminded me of, I don't know, the night sky or something. But when everybody walks in and everybody's just said, oh, they were beautiful, it just starts to feel like the whole book is a thirst trap.
And the guy that I foresee becoming the love interest in this book, like, I'm just not interested in him at all. And it's not to say that you can't do this trope well, because I feel like that's kind of how Cardan was in The Cruel Prince, which I actually grew to like him as a character. He was enjoyable, and you got to see more depth, but just up front, it always seems like this guy's so hard on the outside, but he's soft on the inside. It just doesn't seem like a real person. And I think the next thing we both laughed out loud at while reading this was there's literally an evil stepmother and she laughs maniacally. Like, I'm sorry, if you're writing an adult book, period, like, go ahead and throw that in kids' books. It's fun and all with that. Nobody laughs maniacally. Like, that's just not a real thing. There's certain tropes that can be done certain ways that can be done well. Laughing maniacally, my opinion, cut that out. Done. Not real. It's horrible and cheesy. Okay, and so Seema's been a little more well-read in romantasy, and she's given some of the bigger ones a try, and she actually did read the first few books of the Throne of Glass series.
Yes, I think I read the first 2 or 3, and then I don't know, I'm sorry everyone who really likes that. It felt like the whole book was trope after trope and no actual plot. And I think the biggest thing that irritated and got me to stop reading is, and I don't know if it's a trope, but I've read a lot of books that had this rough, strong, independent woman and a guy who would kind of soften her up and love her the way she is. And I just feel like it's been a little bit overdone and at some points just not done well enough. Besides from Throne and Glass, I feel like we kind of saw that in The Darker Shade of Magic, and we talked more about Lila's character in our video about that book that we read together. We just felt like Lila was rough because she had a hard childhood. Not to say that a rough childhood is not a good reason to have a rough main character, but I feel like at this point, we just need more for this to not turn into just empty trope.
And you need to really put yourself in their mindset. Morally gray characters are a really big thing now, and rather than just having someone that's fine killing and stealing, I want to see why they're justifying these things. I want to see them as humans, there's no fun in a flat character that's just evil or hard for the sake of being hard. And with all tropes, kind of touching on our last bit on romantasy, I think there's power in using tropes for story structure and especially archetypes, like, the dark brooding guy, things like that. There's fun ways to play with them and surprise the audience, but I really don't like knowing about tropes going into a book. And the biggest one, I guess, that bothers me is having a book advertised as enemies to lovers. Like, you're spoiling a huge point of the plot there. So it's like, I'm fine if the book is about enemies to lovers, but if you're advertising it right there, I'm going to know that that enemy, even though I might figure it out as you start reading, I'm going to know that they're not a threat. I'm going to know they end up together. And I feel like it's so much better, especially those kind of books, to go in blind. While reading The Cruel Prince, you kind of figured that they were going to end up with each other. And I'd seen some art of these characters together. But before we even got to that point, I thought that the main character, Jude, was going to end up with someone else because I hadn't looked too deep into it. And to have surprises like that, I think, is a really big, powerful thing. So when, especially as authors, when you're advertising your tropes, I personally, as a reader, just want to go in more open-minded. Okay, and there are some tropes out there that can be done well. I want to talk especially about Ryan Castle's The Bound and the Broken series, which I think is magnificent. But I personally am really over Dragon Riders. And I know this is going to make a lot of people mad, because you have, especially like Aragon, which is so many people's beloved series. I know I'm in the minority when I hear the word Dragon Rider, I'm turned away from the book, because it just feels like a rehashing of a story. Whereas you look into books like Of Blood and Fire and Ryan Castle's series, it is really well done, and it's not all about Dragon Riders. It's this big classic epic fantasy world, and I think there's value in classic epic fantasy. But just throwing Dragon Riders into books over and over again, like, give us something new. And I almost feel like, even though I haven't read Fourth Wing, they just took the most sellable points. Dragon Riders, school setting, and enemies to lovers. And pitched it out there, and, you know, it did well. And it's one of the interesting things that I think that there is some other things that you can go to. You don't need it to be necessarily Dragon Riders. You can have people writing things, but come on, like, be a little more creative than having just straight up dragons, which is so cool in Sanderson's books. Even though, like, Dragonsteel is his thing and there are dragons in the world, they're not Dragon Rider books. The steeds that they ride are different. The big creatures, completely new. And I think that that's one of the greatest things to see that will make me really respect an author, is when they have just something completely new and magnificent.
Yeah, I think the only time when I personally would prefer a dragon over a new interesting beast, if it's based on specific folklore, where dragons are like, this is a part of folklore. But besides of that, I feel like I want something new.
And this is another, I don't know if you can even say trope, but European fantasy seems to be the big overarching one. And I feel really drawn to ones that turn away from that. So, like, really big respect to authors that do that, like Ken Liu, Asian and also American inspired. Like, if you really look into the story structure, or R.F. Kuang, M.L. Wong, just, I dig those, or Zamel Akhtar with Gunmetal Gods. So it's really cool to see people step away from just the generic setting and to give something completely new, even though that's not much of a trope. That's just something that's always on my mind when I'm looking for books.
I don't know if people are going to disagree with me on this one, but I personally cannot stand a villainous villain that is evil just because they want power or just because they're evil. I feel like the greatest villains are the ones that I can relate with and that teach you a lesson. They teach you a lesson on where they cross the line, why they cross the line. And instead of learning that evil is evil, you learn what makes evil evil. When does it cross the line? And it teaches you something. So I really need that backstory to a villain, or at least some explanation of why they're doing what they're doing in the first book. I'm kind of impatient in that way. Like, I cannot stand a villainous villain even for one book, especially if it's a series. I feel like in the first one, I need to already understand them. And that is why I love the ending of The Final Empire. Like, I understood why that villain did what he did, and I was like, yes. The only time when I'm fine with a just evil villain is when they're metaphorical. So if it's more of like a fairy tale-ish book, or if it's more of a metaphorical book, when they stand to, for example, show humanity's greed or humanity's lust for power or something. When they're metaphorical, I'm fine with them just being evil because they represent something that we have inside of all of us.
And I think that's the value we see in Sauron, which is literally called like the Dark Lord in it. And usually that term gives you the idea of, oh, this person's evil for the sake of being evil, where he is just evil there. But when you see the characters interact with the ring and how it twists them, you see that selfishness that really transformed Gollum, you see why one became that way, because they gave into that lust for power. There are things that you look into, and a lot of people might get the wrong idea with what we're saying here, that, oh, we want to like see why the villains are still good. But no, of course there is evil out there, but when you see a realistic villain, it is that warning sign. So you see where they start to justify greed, pride, power, the tipping point, and it almost warns you as a reader to see that, yeah, normal people can become these because they lead down a trail of justifications. You look at Game of Thrones, it's all about that. There is no definite good and bad people. There are just people that are more invested in their pride rather than the good of the people. And one of the most valuable times this has ever been done is in the comic book and now animated series Invincible. I'm not going to spoil things, but I think that Invincible might have the best written villains ever when you just look at what they are. There is a villain later on in the series that it becomes the president of the United States. I'm not going to reveal who it is, so we don't give away spoilers, but this is probably the best villain I've ever read. He's kind of that Thanos. You see where he's coming from, and when he emerges almost victorious, you realize it's not that bad of a thing, and he makes him so much more interesting, even though you loathe him on the inside. Or you look at the Viltrumites in Invincible, and you get to see that these are people that their race is so focused on something that is so different from the humans on Earth that it adds so much to their character depth, rather than just having people that want to conquer the world or things like that. The last one I want to touch on is going back to romance. That not all romance has to be that first encounter, first love. It can be marital love. And there are so many unfaithful spouses or couples in books that don't represent just a wholesome married couple. This really came to mind around the time that Josiah Bancroft released The Hexologist, which is probably our next book that we'll read together, because I loved his Books of Babel series, starting with Senlin Ascends. He really focuses on, a pair of detectives, and they are a married couple, a wholesome married couple that isn't hiding secrets and stuff like that. And I think that there's just so much power in really making that a thing and showing that there is love beyond that first honeymoon love that we see in books that really might deceive young readers into seeing what true love really is.
I have a theory why we don't have a lot of, wholesome married couples in books. Because a committed marriage is predictable. They're going to live happily ever after. And I feel like readers, especially those who want romance, they need unpredictability. They need something, not to know how it's going to end up. And with marriage, it's just, they love each other and that's it.
Interesting point. We hope that you enjoyed watching this, and I want to know what are your favorite tropes that you'd like to see more of, and the tropes that you really hope we get rid of. Throw them in the comments, because we'd love to chat.
Thank you for watching.